Module 8, Evolution, Microevolution, and Macroevolution. Let's review the scientific method process. Remember that after observations are taken, a hypothesis is made. Next, the hypothesis has to be tested by experimentation. If the experimental data support the hypothesis, then with more and more supportive data, it will eventually become a theory. However, if the data do not support the hypothesis, then it has to be altered or discarded. And this is where Darwin's hypothesis hit some trouble. Once Darwin left the HMS Beagle, he started to experiment with pigeons. He bred them, trying to see if natural selection would produce a new species. He also talked with animal breeders, interviewing those who bred dogs, horses, and pigeons in order to see if their experience would help guide him in further experimentation. From his interviews, he learned that lots of evidence confirmed a part of his hypothesis. He noted that, for example, many breeders experienced, over the course of lots of generations, success in producing pigeons that were so different from the original pigeon breed that they were reasonably classified as a new pigeon species. He also discovered the same information with breeding dogs and horses. Look at these wolves. They're similar to, but not exactly, like domesticated dogs. Darwin used this as another bit of evidence for his hypothesis. Wild dogs look and behave differently than domestic ones. That means, according to our definition of a species, domesticated dogs are a very different species from them. However, many generations ago, domestic dogs were wild dogs that men started to train. Over generations, dog breeders would selectively choose those dogs with the best domestication traits and allow only those to mate. The wilder dogs would not be allowed to reproduce. This was man-made selection that Darwin realized was like natural selection. It let the small natural variations that happen during reproduction to pile up and eventually lead to a new species of dog, a domesticated one. Darwin took the information from the breeders along with his personal observations and came up with a valid scientific theory that stated that the natural variations which happen during the process of reproduction could, under natural or man-made selection, take one species and pile up so many changes that could result in an organism that could reasonably be classified as another species. Thus, he showed that his explanation for the presence of various finch species on the Galapagos was scientifically viable. He also invalidated an idea that had been established for generations, the idea of the immutability of species. The immutability of species is the idea that each individual species on the planet was specially created by God and could never fundamentally change. You see, back in Darwin's day, scientists believed that every type of creature on Earth has existed the same as it has since creation. So in the Garden of Eden, there would have been dachshunds, Great Danes, and boxer dogs, along with all other breeds. And each of these dog breeds lived unchanged from that time until now. But Darwin explained how this was not true. All of these dog breeds came from an original dog ancestor, maybe a mutt-like wild dog, and the natural variations that happened during reproduction, along with the environmental stresses that caused some features to be helpful for survival, resulted in the many breeds of dog that we see today. Those stresses were called natural selection, or they could also be a result of man-caused selection. It might sound like Darwin supported his entire theory from this information. However, in reality, he only showed to be true a small part of his evolution hypothesis. It certainly was a revolutionary idea that one finch, over the course of many generations, could give rise to many different finch species. But Darwin had taken that idea much further in his hypothesis. He suggested that via this same process, over the course of millions or billions of years, eventually, those changes would cause that ancestral finch to give rise to an eagle. And this is where the problems were when Darwin tried to compare this part of the hypothesis to the data. For example, the data showed that an ancestral species of wild dog could, over a certain amount of time, give rise to several domestic dog breeds. but the data did not show how that ancestral dog could give rise to a completely different species like a horse. Darwin did find a small bit of evidence for this idea, but it was inconclusive at best, and there was lots of contradicting data too. In fact, Darwin spent most of his book discussing the problems with his hypothesis. We can say then that Darwin found plenty of evidence that a basic life form, such as a dog, could give rise to many other specialized species of the same type of life form, such as many other species of dog. And this could occur as a result of genetic variations that are guided by natural or man-made selection. But when it came to showing that a basic life form like a dog could evolve into a very different life form, such as a horse, by the same natural or man-made selection processes, there was very little evidence for the hypothesis and lots of evidence against it. Thus, modern scientists have divided Darwin's theory of evolution into two parts: the theory of microevolution and the hypothesis of macroevolution. Microevolution is the theory that natural selection can, over time, take an organism and transform it into a more specialized species of that organism, while macroevolution is the hypothesis that processes similar to those at work in microevolution can, over eons of time, transform an organism into a completely different kind of organism. These two terms are very different, and you need to make sure you understand that difference. There's a great deal of evidence that supports the idea of microevolution, and thus it's a well-documented scientific theory. However, there is very little evidence for macroevolution, and a great deal of evidence against it, that it is at best an unconfirmed hypothesis. This brings up a question. If there wasn't much evidence in support of macroevolution and lots of support against it, why was it so popular among scientists? Well, Darwin said that because microevolution was scientifically possible, then macroevolution should be the obvious continuation of it. He believed that if finches could change a little during a small amount of time with varied beak shapes, then wouldn't they change a lot during a large amount of time? Of course, he had to assume that the amount of change any species could have would be limitless as long as it had plenty of time. In his day, scientists thought that was a reasonable statement. They didn't have the genetic understanding we have today, and they didn't know that the genetic code is what determines the range of characteristics within a species. So they didn't understand that the natural variation in reproduction is a result of different alleles in a species' genetic code being expressed in different individuals. Because we know that the number of alleles within an organism's genes is limited, we also know that the natural variation that happens during reproduction will be limited too. So, in opposition to what Darwin proposed, the variation that a species experiences is not unlimited. It can only vary by the number and type of alleles within a species' genetic code. That's why we know that macroevolution can't happen the same way that microevolution does. Additionally, we can actually observe microevolution happening as a result of natural selection. For example, insects produce large numbers of offspring, and they have relatively short lives, so we can see their genetic changes more quickly. If this group of insects was exposed to pesticides, for example, the first application of the pesticide would kill most of them, leaving, say, 3 still living. This red insect would represent an individual who is carrying a gene for resistance to the pesticide. As these surviving insects reproduce, the one carrying the resistance gene passed it on to the offspring. Then, during the second pesticide application, all of the insects with the resistance gene, and a few without, will survive and reproduce. Now only one of the non-resistant insects survived. Well, after more and more applications of the pesticide, we would find that the population of the insects will have more and more individuals that carry a resistance gene. However, for this to happen, the original red insect here had to already have a resistance gene in its genetic code, and the environment around it made it a good trait to have for survival, making it more likely to pass that beneficial gene to its offspring and less likely for it and its offspring to die from the pesticides. Now let's talk about macroevolution. It's a very different thing. Macroevolution has to assume that a specific organism has an unlimited ability to change. That means there needs to be a way to add information to an individual's genetic code. Now, there are only a specific number of genes and alleles of those genes, right? Thus, there is only a certain number of possible variations in genotype, which means there's a limited number of resulting phenotypes. To get an unlimited amount of change, then, an organism has to find a way to add genes and alleles to its genome. That's very different from microevolution, and it's where the scientific controversy lies. Be sure you understand the difference between micro and macroevolution, particularly by looking at genetics. When a species varies within its genetic code, we're talking about microevolution. That's how we have so many dog breeds today, coming from wild dogs, and it's how the Galapagos finches formed so many species. However, if a species suddenly adds more information to its genetic code, then we are talking about macroevolution. Microevolution is a well-established scientific theory, while macroevolution is really just an unconfirmed hypothesis. We just covered how Darwin had a good amount of evidence for microevolution and established it as a theory, but he didn't have any evidence for macroevolution. As scientists started to understand genetics, they eventually could see why. Microevolution is just variation of a type of organism within its genetic code and fits what we know about genetics today. It is explainable and observable. But macroevolution requires additional information to an organism's genetic code. So macroevolution scientists altered Darwin's original theory and call the new theory neo-Darwinism. Neo-Darwinists suggest that this extra information could happen via mutation. Darwin thought macroevolution could happen by the normal changes that occur during reproduction, and those changes could continue indefinitely. But genetics helps us to see that this could not occur under normal circumstances. Mutations, which are mistakes that change a genetic code, are the only way that more information could be added to an organism's genome. But remember from the last module that genetic alterations are often very bad for an organism. Now, that doesn't have to be the case every time. It is possible that a few good mutations could happen in a species, and they might, by blind chance, create a new trait in an organism, helping it to better survive. Then that trait would be able to be passed on to offspring, meaning that more information would be a part of that species' genetic code. Lab experimentation and observation reveals a problem with the supposition that more genetic information can be added via mutation. When we see mutations occur, whether it's in a lab or in nature, they do not lead to an increase in the information of an organism's genetic code. Actually, most mutations end up destroying genetic information. Antibiotic-resistant bacteria are a good example of this. You see, antibiotics have long been used to fight off bacterial infections. But as they are used, bacteria can develop strains that are immune. That means they will not be affected by the antibiotics currently being used, and new antibiotics must be found to fight off those resistant strains. This situation of antibiotic-resistant bacteria is commonly used as an example of macroevolution in action. But when we look at the genetics of the organisms, it is actually not supporting this hypothesis. Some of these cases provide additional evidence for microevolution, but the other cases actually provide support against macroevolution. To understand why, you need to understand a bit about how bacteria develop antibiotic resistance. Let's go over a brief introduction to bacteria so you can understand the issue with using antibiotic-resistant bacteria as an example of macroevolution. Bacteria reproduce asexually. That means that the offspring is genetically identical to the parent, but they can add to their genetic codes. One way, called conjugation, is when a bacterium with a certain gene is able to pass that gene to another bacterium that doesn't have it. Transformation is another way to add information. In transformation, a bacterium without a certain gene can absorb it from a dead bacterium that has that gene. Most of the antibiotic-resistant bacteria that scientists have studied use one of these two ways to gain new information. So, when there's a population of bacteria that gets exposed to an antibiotic, most of them will die. But there might be one or two individuals that could have a set of genes that makes them immune to the antibiotic. So if they're able to pass those genes via the process of conjugation or transformation, then several bacteria will also be able to survive the antibiotic. When those bacteria asexually reproduce, more and more resistant bacteria will be formed, eventually building a whole population of resistant bacteria. Now, there's a third way that bacteria can add to their genetic codes, and it's called transduction. It requires the aid of a virus. If a virus infects a population of bacteria, then genetic information can be passed from one bacterium to another as the virus spreads. If a bacterium is able to survive the virus infection, it might end up with extra genetic material, and it might be possible that antibiotic resistance could be passed on this way. But remember, if a bacterium gains its resistance ability in any of these three ways, this means that the genes that provided resistance had to have already existed in some bacteria. So this is not evidence for macroevolution. Macroevolution requires new genes to be created. In these examples, no new genes were involved, but rather existing genes were passed around. In 1988, an interesting study was conducted looking at individual bacteria from the intestines of Antarctic explorers who had been frozen before the development of antibiotics. Interestingly, they had bacteria in their guts that already were resistant to several antibiotics that had not been developed until after the explorers were frozen. So the genes that coded for resistance were already in the bacteria. This means that immunity to antibiotics is really a result of microevolution. The genetic characteristics were already a part of some bacteria's genetic code, and that was passed around to other bacteria, enabling them to survive. So we can say that most antibiotic-resistant bacteria get their resistant ability from genes that already existed. However, there are some types of bacteria that have become resistant to antibiotics because of mutation. Each of those cases, though, reveal that the resistance comes as a result of a loss of information in the bacterial genetic code. For example, the plasma membranes of bacteria have proteins embedded in them so that nutrients can enter the cell. These proteins work well so the bacterium gets the food it needs. But many antibiotics can get into the bacterium through these proteins too, which will of course harm or kill the bacterium. A mutation that destroys or hinders these proteins then will stop or hinder the antibiotic from getting into the cell. That means the bacterium is immune to or able to survive the antibiotic, making it antibiotic resistant. But that also means the bacterium can't get as much food as it needs, so it's a weaker individual. The resistance resulted from a mutation, but it was a loss of information. So even though the bacterium is more likely to survive being exposed to antibiotics, it's a result of less genetic information. There's a survival advantage, but there's no new information in the genetic code. That means this is not a result of macroevolution. Well, this is just a skimming of the information about this topic, but hopefully you'll see that natural selection and mutations may cause changes in an organism, but most, if any, will not create new information.